contents of this video will mostly pertain to the real-life influences of Fatal Frame Maiden of Black Water, the fifth entry in the Fatal Frame series. That being said, the Fatal Frame series is such a rich and complex story interweaving various characters and spanning generations, so if I get a little off topic, please don't hold it against me. Now, without further ado, let's dive into some Japanese horror. One of the main reasons for this video is my ardent love for the Fatal Frame series, which was conceived during my high school years. I was also fascinated by the Buddhist and Shinto-inspired rituals depicted in the games, but having gone to school in the conservative Christian Bible Belt, I always felt too much of an intellectual weenie to do any research on whether or not the truth is indeed stranger than the fiction. But now that I'm a grown-up who sometimes does grown-up things and is only occasionally afraid of disappointing authority figures, I finally mustered up the courage to reawaken my long-dormant curiosity and uncover just where the devs may have gotten some inspiration for the events of Fatal Frame Maiden of Black Water. Let's start with the geographical focal point of the events of the game, Mount Hikami. Some in-game text Ren Hojo finds in the 8th drop explains that Mount Hikami can be translated to the mountain crowned with the sun. This is an oddly uplifting namesake for a place that has seen the horrors that it has, unless we unpack that a little bit. An important location on Mount Hikami is the Twilight Peak. It is the place that orphan children are called to as the sun sets in the realm of the dead, crossing over into the netherworld. You see, in the game, Mount Hikami is seen as a place where the living world and the netherworld intersect, so as the sun sets in the real world, the pervading idea is that the netherworld becomes accessible. Weak-willed people, as well as those who are ready to die, are called by the dark sun, the sun which shines on the land of the dead, to the mountain to cross over. Thus, although the translation of Hikami might at first appear uplifting and even life-affirming, we can see how this translation has a much darker bent upon closer examination. The in-game mountain has several distinctive geographical features of note. First, at Mount Hikami's summit is a caldera lake of clean water that is of particular importance to a sect called the Mikomori, who resided on the mountain. Incidentally, this is also the name associated with the custom of receiving water from Mount Hikami. Water obtained via Mikomori is thought to have cleansing and purifying properties. Thus, people would use it to give a newborn its first bath and to cleanse the bodies of the dead. On the flip side, the Shadow Spring is said to be within an atoll at the center of the lake on the mountain summit. There are also waterfalls and springs that jut off the caldera lake, and finally, a dense forest that surrounds the mountain. Now let's compare the fictional Mount Hikami with a real-life mountain in Aomori Prefecture, Mount Osore. This mountain's name translates to the Mountain of Dread, which definitely is a more straightforward namesake than its fictional counterpart. There's a shrine of the dead on the mountain summit located in a caldera of an active volcano. Sound familiar? And get this, the primary image depicted in the shrine is none other than Jizo, who is thought to be the patron deity of deceased children and aborted fetuses. Interestingly enough, when Yuri visits the rear shrine on the Twilight Peak in the 7th drop, there are statues of Jizo there as well. Due to the volcanic landscape, the mountain became known as a gate to the netherworld. There's even a small brook running off the caldera lake at the mountain summit and feeding into a neighboring lake that is thought to be a Sanzu River, or what Westerners might call the River Styx. From this description of Mount Osore, we can see how the concept for Mount Hikami came to fruition. Other locations of note in the fictional game are the Unfathomable Forest, as well as the woods just behind the Shrine of Dolls. One could draw parallels between the Unfathomable Forest and Aokigahara, more popularly known as Suicide Forest. We have a dense forest where several individuals such as Shino Kururugi go to end their lives. I mention her because she is arguably the most significant person to do so, as the forest's main malevolent presence is her brother Kyozo Kururugi. Kyozo kills his sister's lover because he suspects him of abusing Shino. Racked by guilt and grief, Shino comes to the unfathomable forest around Mount Hikami and dies by suicide, as a shrine maiden observes. After hearing of his sister's death, Kyozo visits the mountain with a contrite heart and an intention to die and purify his soul of his crime. But suddenly a rage overpowers him, and he instead viciously murders the shrine maidens on the mountain, even going so far as to gouge out their eyes so they cannot look on him and the atrocities he commits. After these catastrophic events, the forest is riddled with toxic miasma of suicidality and murderous intent. As a clear nod to Aokigahara, the unfathomable forest even has a hanging tree. The final significant location is the wooded area behind the Shrine of Dolls. I can't take all the credit for this one. I actually wouldn't have happened upon this connection without the help of a wonderful streamer whose Twitch link will be in the video's description below. Thanks ChaoticClumsy for introducing me to this paranormal life. Around the time the tourism industry was on the rise in the game world, many of the abandoned structures on Mount Hikami were restored and some were converted into tourist destinations. One such example is a shrine that was converted into a hotel and hot spring. But one location that was relatively preserved as is was the Shrine of Dolls. Curious people who came to the mountain were intrigued by the amount of dolls within and around the shrine, as well as the fact that many of the older-looking dolls had names etched into them. Many believe the reason for this was that these dolls housed the spirits of dead children from the Miko Mori and other earlier residents of the mountain. When tourism came to Mount Hikami, this spot became an attraction. A comparable real-life location would be the Island of Dolls, or La Isla de las Muñecas. This is an island to the south of Mexico City. It is rumored that the island's first inhabitant discovered the body of a dead girl in the water, and accompanying her was a doll. The sole occupant of the island gave the girl a proper burial, but is rumored to have been visited by the angry spirit of the girl who demanded back her doll. He hung up the doll in an attempt to placate the troubled spirit, but to no avail. Then he began rooting through the trash on the mainland in order to find more dolls to hang up that could possibly belong to the girl, and thus the Island of Dolls was born. Eventually, this became a popular tourist destination that people still visit to this day, bringing with them their own dolls to offer to the girl's spirit. The striking similarity in the game location is the area of woods behind the house where the player can see many dolls hung up in a similar fashion. But if you thought that was interesting, I'm just getting started, because Fatal Frame isn't about places, it's about people. Granted, mostly dead people. And the fifth installment is specifically about the Maiden of Blackwater. But just who is she? Her name is Ose Kurosawa, a young woman who was encouraged to go to the mountain after she developed a sixth sense during a tragic flooding of her village. Ose goes to the mountain and is selected to be a Great Pillar, which was both an incredible honor and the most excruciating fate that could befall shrine maidens on Mount Hikami. She accepts and prepares herself for the ritual ghost marriage. To commemorate the occasion, it is decided that she should be photographed by Dr. Kunihiko Aso. In their brief interaction, however, the two fall in love, and Ose no longer wishes to be a Great Pillar, and instead desires to live a life with Dr. Aso. Despite that, she still goes through with the ritual. It is thought that her strong desire to remain among the living causes the ritual to fail, and she becomes both tainted by the black water and the eponymous antagonist of the game. More generally, the shrine maidens on Mount Hikami are women with strong spiritual senses, often due to witnessing death and other tragic events, who are called to the mountain to serve as immortal flowers. A special subset of these maidens were then selected to be Great Pillars, maidens selected to be sunk directly into the Shadow Spring. A maiden selected to be a Great Pillar is placed in a casket and submerged in the Shadow Spring in order to protect Mount Hikami and thus preserve the barrier between the world of the living and the world of the dead. As long as a shrine maiden retains her sense of self and resists the influence of the black water, which is no walk in the park, I mean, she literally relives the pain and torment of the deceased for as long as she can bear it. She will remain in an eternal, ageless state between life and death, which fits nicely with the idea that these women literally serve as a barrier between two worlds. One way to prolong an immortal flower's effectiveness and ease her suffering was to conduct a ritual of ghost marriage. This was the only time a maiden's soul would be allowed to leave its casket in order to be joined to a man in marriage, who would then be placed in the casket with her. That is, if the ritual was a success. If it failed, the maiden's effectiveness would wane, and a new pillar would soon be required. But that's not so bad as long as you have more shrine maidens to enlist. And as mentioned earlier, a bunch of shrine maidens were brutally murdered by Kyozo Kururugi, who, in a frenzied rage, slaughtered them and gouged their eyes out so they couldn't look upon his former sins. Note the inflicted blindness is significant. I will explain shortly. Anyway, Kyozo pretty much wiped out all the shrine maidens on Mount Hikami, leading to an overflowing of the black water from the Shadow Spring. While the sources of inspiration for the various in-game locations are interesting, the inspiration behind the shrine maidens is truly fascinating. It appears that the shrine maidens in the game are based off of women known as Itako. Traditionally, Itako were blind women trained as mediums who commune with Shinto spirits as well as spirits of the deceased. The rituals traditionally took place on Mount Osore. Remember how I said Kyozo Kururugi gouged out the Shrine Maiden's eyes as he slaughtered them? This seems like a not-so-subtle nod to a defining characteristic of Itako. Another compelling similarity is the initiation ritual Itako must go through in order to become full-fledged mediums. Young blind girls training to become Itako would have to be drenched in cold water. Over a handful of days, Itako in training would endure buckets of cold water in quantities in the hundreds. During this time, the girls would also fast and would be wearing a white kimono reminiscent of a burial robe. This was all to prepare her for a marriage contract with the patron kami. These conditions would be so taxing that many young women would lose consciousness, which is the point at which people thought the ritual was successful and the kami took hold. Then the Itako would be dressed in a red marriage kimono and a marriage ceremony would follow. At that point, we have our full-fledged Itako. During the westernization of the Meiji era, the various practices of the Itako were outlawed, and many women seen performing rituals would be arrested for spreading superstition or even being considered a hindrance to the embracing of Western medicine. It is not hard to see the similarities between the Maidens of Black Water and the Itako. We have blind spirits of women who haunt Mount Hikami, remnants of a bygone religious sect who no longer have a place in modern Japanese society. From the Meiji era to the present day, the number of Itako have dwindled to around 20 or so. Similarly, the number of shrine maidens dwindled until the failed ritual with Ose Kurosawa that precipitated the calamity on the mountain. Ghost marriages were also central to the Maidens of Black Water being able to fulfill their duties on Mount Hikami. And finally, if this isn't the coolest connection in the world, I don't know what is. Upon completing the game for the first time, we are rewarded with an alternate costume for Yuri Kozukata, a white kimono.